The overhead lights flicker once, then steady. A gunshot echoes from the parking structure, and the ER doors burst open before anyone can react. Screaming, chairs overturned. A man in a torn jacket drags a wounded soldier through the entrance, shouting for help nobody in the room seems equipped to give. The staff freeze. Except one. She's already moving, quiet, unhurried, hands steady on the gurney rail. Nobody notices the way her eyes scan the exits first, the way her fingers find the man's pulse without looking. A nurse, they assume. Just a nurse. They have no idea what she used to carry before she carried a clipboard. Somewhere outside, a radio crackles with a frequency no civilian hospital should recognize. And for the first time tonight, she looks up. The rain had stopped an hour before midnight, but the smell of it still clung to the automatic doors of St. Augustine Medical Center, drifting in each time someone walked through. Mara Coleman stood at the nurse's station, charting vitals in handwriting so neat it looked typed. Around her, the ER moved at its usual tired rhythm, a monitor beeping somewhere down the hall, a resident arguing quietly with a vending machine, the low hum of fluorescent lights that never quite turned off. She had been at St. Augustine for 14 months, long enough to know which coffee machine actually worked, long enough for the other nurses to stop asking questions about the 2-year gap in her resume, long enough that most people had simply decided there was nothing interesting to ask about. She preferred it that way. "Coleman, bed 6 needs a line changed," said Priya. The charge nurse, not looking up from her tablet. "Guy's been in a mood since triage." On it, Mara set down her pen with the same unhurried motion she did everything. No wasted movement, no rushed steps. It was something people noticed without noticing. Dr. Ellison, one of the senior attendings, had mentioned it once in passing. "You've got the calmest hands in this building, Coleman. Ever think about surgery?" She'd smiled and said she liked nursing fine, and he hadn't pushed. Bed 6 held a man in his 50s, irritable from pain and dehydration, complaining before she'd even pulled back the curtain. She listened, replaced the IV with 3 efficient motions, and had him settled before he finished his sentence about the wait time. He blinked at her, mid-complaint, and said, "Huh, that didn't hurt at all." "It's not supposed to," she said, and moved on. This was the shape of her days now. Small competencies, small kindnesses. Nothing that drew a second look, nothing that required explanation. She had built a life out of the unremarkable, brick by brick, and most nights it felt almost peaceful, a version of peace she had not expected to find, and did not entirely trust. At 11:47 p.m., a metal tray slipped from a supply cart 2 bays down and hit the tile floor with a flat, ringing clang. Every head in the vicinity turned toward the sound, a reflex, nothing more. The kind of universal flinch a loud noise produces in any tired hospital at night. Mara's turned too. But where the others simply looked, her body had already shifted weight onto the balls of her feet, angled slightly toward the nearest exit, eyes flicking not to the tray but past it, to the doors, to the hallway, to the shape of the room and who occupied it, before her mind consciously caught up with what her hands and feet had already decided to do. It lasted less than a second. Then she exhaled, saw it was nothing, and bent down to help a flustered orderly gather the scattered gauze packets. "Sorry," the young man said. "Didn't mean to spook everyone." "You didn't," she said, and meant it, though something in her chest was still settling, like a bell that had been struck and was only now going quiet. Priya had seen it, though. She always seemed to see things. "You did that weird thing again," Priya said later, leaning against the med cart while Mara restocked Bay 6. "The listening thing. Like you're waiting for something." "What thing?" "I don't know how to describe it. You get still. Like still and ready." My uncle was a cop for 20 years, and he used to do that at restaurants. Always sat facing the door. Mara kept her eyes on the supply drawer, counting syringes she didn't need to count. Bad habit from a stressful job, I guess. Nursing'll do that. Something like that. Priya didn't press further. She rarely did. Which was, Mara suspected, exactly why she had lasted this long without harder questions. But there was a flicker in her friend's expression, brief and curious, the kind of look that filed information away rather than discarding it. Mara had learned to notice those looks. She had learned, a long time ago, in circumstances very different from this one, that the people who noticed quietly were often more dangerous to a secret than the ones who asked loudly. She finished the shelf, closed the cart and told herself, as she often did, that there was nothing left to notice, that the woman she had been before St. Augustine, before the quiet apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, before the careful anonymity she wore like a second uniform, belonged to a different life, filed away as completed, closed, done. It was, for the most part, true. She did not miss the noise of that life. She did not miss the weight of decisions that could not be undone. What she carried now was smaller and, in its own way, harder. The discipline of staying invisible, of doing enough good in small, quiet ways that the larger silence around her didn't feel like a waste. At midnight, she took her 10-minute break in the stairwell, where the fire door propped open let in cold air and the distant sound of traffic. She drank lukewarm coffee from a paper cup and watched headlights sweep across the wet parking lot 3 floors below. Somewhere out past the hospital's edge, past the orange glow of streetlights, the world went on with its ordinary chaos. Arguments, accidents, small emergencies that would eventually find their way to her ER, one gurney at a time. She did not know yet that one of them was already moving toward her. Had already left a checkpoint 40 miles east, wrapped in gauze and secrecy, escorted by men who would not identify themselves at the door. She did not know that a radio frequency she hadn't heard in 2 years was, at that exact moment, being repeated over a channel 11 miles from where she stood, carried by wind and static toward a receiver she no longer owned. She finished her coffee, crushed the cup, went back inside. The rest of the shift passed in its familiar rhythm. A child with a fractured wrist, an elderly man short of breath, a woman crying quietly in triage over a boyfriend who wasn't answering his phone. Mara moved through each of them with the same even hands, the same unremarkable calm, offering competence instead of comfort, because competence, she had found, was its own kind of comfort when delivered without hesitation. At 2:14 a.m., Priya glanced up from the admissions board and said, almost idly, "Heard there's some kind of security thing happening on the interstate. Convoy got rerouted or something. My cousin's a trooper, said nobody's talking about it." Mara did not look up from the chart in her hands. "Probably nothing." "Probably," Priya agreed, and turned back to her screen. But something in the room had shifted for Mara. A small, cold clarity, arriving without fanfare, the way old instincts return not as memory but as certainty. She did not know what was coming. She only knew, with the particular stillness of someone who has waited for bad news before, that the quiet part of the night was ending. She set down the chart, straightened her scrub top, and went to check on bed 6 one more time, because it was, after all, simply her job. Nothing more. Nothing anyone needed to notice, not yet. By 3 in the morning, the ER had entered the lull that came before the pre-dawn rush, the hour when the drunk driving cases had mostly cleared out, and the heart attacks hadn't started yet. Mara used the quiet to restock the crash cart in Bay 4, checking expiration dates on epinephrine with the same patience she applied to everything else. It was Dr. Ellison who brought the first real threat of it into the room, though he didn't know that's what he was doing. "Anyone else's radio doing something weird tonight?" he asked, coming out of the break room with a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting too long. "EMS band's been chattering nonstop for like 20 minutes. Something about a road closure out past Route 9 accident," Priya asked. "Didn't sound like it. Sounded more like they were clearing the highway. On purpose." He shrugged, the shrug of a man who had learned long ago not to spend too much curiosity on things outside his own department. "Anyway, if we get an MVA tonight, that's probably why." Mara kept counting vials. Route 9 ran east out of the city, toward the old logistics corridor that fed into Fort Callahan, a name she hadn't let herself think in over a year, and which now sat in her mind like a stone dropped into still water. She told herself it meant nothing. Convoys moved supplies that way all the time. Training exercises rerouted traffic more often than the public ever heard about. There was no reason a road closure on Route 9 should mean anything to a nurse who hadn't worn a different uniform in 26 months, and yet her hands, without her quite deciding it, had stopped moving. "You good?" Priya asked, glancing over. "Fine." Mara resumed counting. Lost track for a second. She finished the cart and told herself that was the end of it. It wasn't. At 3:40, one of the paramedics who ran the overnight transfer routes, a heavyset, easygoing man named Duarte, who Mara had traded shift change small talk with for over a year, came through the ambulance bay doors for a coffee run, shaking rain off his jacket even though it hadn't rained in an hour. "You believe this?" he said to no one in particular, dropping quarters into the vending machine. "Dispatch just told us to hold all non-emergency transports for the next 2 hours." No explanation. "Just hold position, stand by, like we're in the army or something." Mara, passing behind him with a stack of folded linens, felt something in her chest tighten, small and precise, like a key turning half a click in a lock. "Did they say why?" Duarte glanced back at her, mildly surprised she'd asked. She rarely engaged in station gossip. "Nah, just some kind of security sweep," they said. "Probably a VIP thing. Politician's motorcade, maybe." He shrugged, the same shrug Ellison had given, the universal gesture of people who did not need to know more because it did not touch their lives. It touched hers. She just couldn't yet say how. She carried the linens to the supply room and stood there a moment longer than necessary, folding a already folded pillowcase, using the motion to steady something underneath her ribs that she did not have a name for anymore. 2 years of careful distance from that world, and it took nothing more than a paramedic's idle complaint to make her feel the old alertness rise in her like water finding its level. "It's not your problem anymore," she told herself, the way she had told herself 100 times before. "You checked that uniform in. You don't get called back just because a truck got rerouted." She almost believed it. At 4:02, she stepped into the stairwell again for air, and that was when she heard it. Not through any hospital system, but through the old handheld radio Duarte had left charging on the supply cart near the ambulance bay, its volume turned up out of habit more than necessity. A burst of chatter, mostly encrypted static, and then, for less than 2 seconds, a voice clear enough to catch 3 words before the channel dropped back into noise. "Ranger element inbound." She stood very still. It could have meant anything. Could have been unrelated cross-chatter from a state police channel. Could have been civilian confusion over jargon. Could have been nothing at all. Coincidence dressed up as significance because her mind was primed to hear it that way. She told herself this several times in the clinical. Even tone she used to calm frightened patients. It did not work as well on herself. She returned to the ER floor with her expression exactly as it had been 15 minutes earlier. Calm, present, unremarkable, because that expression was a discipline, not a mood, and she had spent 2 years training herself to maintain it regardless of what moved beneath it. She checked on the child with the fractured wrist, made sure his cast was setting properly, told his mother it would heal clean by the end of summer. But some part of her, deeper and older than the persona she wore at St. Augustine, had already begun preparing, not for anything specific. She had no name yet, no face, no confirmed threat. Only a shift in the room's pressure, the kind she used to feel before deployments were announced, before quiet nights turned into long ones. She thought of Priya's words from hours earlier. "You get still, like you're waiting for something," and understood, with a small, unwelcome clarity, that Priya had not been wrong. At 4:30, the overhead PA system crackled once, and a voice, hospital administration, calm and procedural, announced that St. Augustine had been designated as a receiving facility for an incoming priority transport. ETA unknown, and that Trauma Bay 1 should be cleared and prepped immediately. No further explanation was given. None ever was in Mara's experience when the explanation mattered most. She looked up at the speaker in the ceiling, and for the first time in 14 months, felt the 2 halves of her life, the nurse and whatever had come before the nurse, and begin, very quietly, to move toward each other. She set down her chart, walked to Trauma Bay 1 and began preparing it herself, before anyone told her to. Trauma Bay 1 had the particular stillness of a room built for chaos but currently holding its breath. Mara moved through it with quick, practiced hands, clearing the counter, checking the crash cart, laying out intubation equipment, though no one had told her intubation would be needed. She worked from instinct now, not instruction, and some part of her noted, distantly, how easily the old rhythms came back, like a language she'd told herself she'd forgotten. Dr. Ellison arrived at 4:52, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, his usual morning tiredness replaced by the sharpened focus of a physician who sensed something unusual approaching. They said priority transport. That's all administration will say. You'd think the president was coming in. Maybe he is, Priya said, only half joking, wheeling in a second crash cart just in case. Mara said nothing. She was watching the ambulance bay doors. At 4:58, headlights swept across the glass by not one set but three moving in tight formation, none of them marked as standard EMS. Two black SUVs flanked a windowless transport van, all three vehicles executing the kind of disciplined, close-interval convoy driving that civilian drivers never bothered to learn. Mara recognized the spacing before she recognized anything else. Regulation distance, defensive formation, the kind of driving that assumed someone might be watching and might be aiming. The van doors opened before it had fully stopped. Two men in tactical gear, no visible insignia, no hospital badges. Faces set in the particular blankness of people trained not to react, pulled a gurney from the back with brisk efficiency. On it lay a man in his 30s, shirt cut away, a field dressing soaked through at the abdomen, his face gray with blood loss. A third man, older, walked alongside with his hand resting near his hip in a way that was not casual. Gunshot wound, lower right quadrant, entry and exit. Approximately 90 minutes old, one of the tactical men said, voice clipped, giving Ellison the information a paramedic would normally relay. Except this man was not a paramedic, and everyone in the room seemed to understand that without being told. Field stabilized. He needs surgery now. Copy that. Who is he? Ellison asked, already moving, already scanning the wound as they transferred the patient to the trauma bed. That's not relevant to his treatment, the older man said, not unkindly but with total finality. He produced a folded card from his jacket. Mara caught only a flash of a federal seal before it disappeared again, and said, I need this room, and I need to know every person in it by name before we go further. Priya bristled, the way she did whenever anyone tried to run her ER for her. Sir, this is a hospital. We treat first, we ask questions. I understand your policy, the man said. This isn't a request. Mara, standing at the head of the bed already checking the patient's airway, felt the room's temperature drop several degrees, the particular chill of civilians realizing they'd stepped into something with rules they didn't know. She did not look up at the federal agent. She was looking at the wounded man's gear, what was left of it, cut away and shoved to the side of the gurney in a growing pile of ruined fabric. A strap. Webbing, actually, not standard-issue tactical gear, but a very specific weave, stitched in a pattern she recognized the way someone recognizes a childhood street even after years away. Attached to it, half-torn, a small patch, edges frayed, the kind of patch units wore quietly, unofficially, meant to be recognized only by people who had earned the right to recognize it. She had worn a version of that patch once. Not the same unit, but close enough in the same family of close enough that her pulse did something it hadn't done in 2 years. Special operations. Not conventional. Not what the agent's cover story would suggest. BP's dropping, she said aloud, keeping her voice level, keeping her eyes on the monitor rather than the patch. 82/50 and falling. He needs blood now, not paperwork. Ellison shot her a grateful look and barked orders. 2 units, type O, get anesthesia on standby. Prep for immediate exploratory surgery. The room moved. The federal agent did not. I need everyone in this room vetted, he said again, louder now, to Ellison specifically. This patient's identity is classified. If word of his location leaves this building, then you can vet us after he's not bleeding out on my table, Ellison snapped. And for a moment the standoff held, federal authority against medical urgency, neither side willing to yield first. Mara made a decision in the space of half a second, the kind of decision she used to make often and had told herself she would never make again. She stepped slightly between the agent's sightline and the patient's exposed gear, using her body and a fresh trauma blanket to cover the ruined strap and patch as though tidying the bed, a small, invisible act, the kind no one in the room would remember happening, because it looked like nothing at all. She had not decided to protect the man's identity out of duty to some old code. She had decided it because some part of her recognized what was stitched into that patch and understood, with the flat, wordless certainty of shared history, that if the wrong person saw it before this man reached the OR, the room would become far more dangerous than a simple gunshot wound. Sir, she said to the agent, voice calm, professional, deliberately unremarkable, with respect. Every second you spend establishing protocol is a second. His heart isn't getting enough blood. I've cleared his gear for infection control. There's nothing left on him to identify. It was not quite a lie. It was the kind of half-truth she had once been trained to deliver under far worse pressure, and it came out of her now with unsettling ease. The agent studied her for a moment, not suspicious exactly, but assessing, the way people in his line of work assessed everyone, reflexively, as either asset or liability. Something in her tone or her stillness, or the precise way she'd phrased cleared his gear for infection control, a phrase with a double meaning only someone from his world would catch, made him pause. "Get him into surgery," he said finally, stepping back. "I'll be right outside that door. Nobody talks about this patient. Not his name, not his condition, not anything you saw on him. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Ellison said, already wheeling the bed toward the OR corridor. As they moved, Mara walked alongside the gurney for the last few feet before the doors that led beyond her authority, and the wounded man's eyes opened, barely, the flicker of someone surfacing from shock rather than sleep. His gaze found her face, unfocused, uncertain, and for one disorienting second he mouthed something soundless, his lips forming words she couldn't quite parse. She leaned closer instinctively. "Tell them. Whiskey's down!" His voice was barely a breath, cracked and fading. "Tell them whiskey's..." Then his eyes rolled back, and the anesthesiologist was pulling him through the doors, and the moment was gone. Mara stood at the threshold, the OR doors swinging shut in front of her, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Whiskey, a call sign. Not a common one. Not one she should have any business knowing, but she did. She turned back toward the ER floor, where the federal agent stood watching her with new and quiet interest, his earlier assessment clearly revising itself in real time. Priya was staring at her too, along with two other nurses, all of them having just watched her handle a federal standoff with a calm none of them had ever seen from her before. "Coleman," Priya said slowly. "What was that?" Mara held her friend's gaze for a beat, searching for the right unremarkable answer, and found for the first time in 14 months that she didn't have one ready. "Just doing my job," she said instead, and walked back toward the nurses' station before anyone could ask a second question. Behind her, the federal agent had not stopped watching. The federal agent's name, Mara learned within the hour, was Halverson. He did not offer it easily. Priya extracted it from him the way she extracted most information, through sheer persistent friendliness that wore down more guarded people than him. He stood near the OR corridor with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking too quietly for anyone to follow, occasionally glancing toward the doors as if he could see through them by will alone. Mara kept her distance from him deliberately. Every instinct she'd spent 2 years bearing told her that the less visible she was to a man like Halverson, the better. He had already looked at her twice with the particular attention of someone recalculating a first impression. She did not want a third look. She busied herself instead with the ordinary business of the floor, vitals, charts, a toddler with croup crying in Bay 2, and told herself the strange, cold clarity of the last hour was passing. It wasn't. It was only waiting. At 5:40 a.m., a new face appeared at the nurse's station, wearing hospital scrubs a half-size too clean. A laminated visitor badge clipped slightly crooked at the collar. He introduced himself to Priya as a transfer coordinator from County General, here to review a chart for an incoming patient swap. His voice was easy, apologetic about the early hour, his smile the practiced kind that worked on tired people at 5 in the morning. Priya, tired and unsuspicious, pulled up the requested chart without hesitation. Mara noticed him the way she noticed everything now, not consciously, not with alarm, but with the accumulating weight of small details that didn't sit right. His badge was crooked because it was new, the lamination still faintly tacky at the corner, not worn soft the way month-old badges were. His shoes were wrong, heavy-soled, laced tight, the kind of shoes built for standing braced rather than walking hospital floors for 12 hours. And his eyes, when they swept the room under the guise of idle curiosity, moved in a pattern she recognized instantly, not looking at people, looking at exits, at cameras, at the location of the security desk relative to the OR corridor. She had done that exact sweep herself, more times than she could count, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. She did not react. She continued restocking a supply drawer 3 feet away, angled so she could watch him in her peripheral vision without appearing to watch him at all. A skill so old it required no conscious effort. like breathing, like the stillness Priya had once called the listening thing. Transfers for a post-op patient. Room 214, the man said to Priya, glancing at the chart she'd pulled up. Actually, while I'm here, mind if I use your restroom? Long drive. Down the hall past the vending machines, Priya said, already turning back to her screen, already 3 tasks ahead in her mind. The man thanked her and walked, not toward the restroom. Mara noted immediately, but passed it toward the OR corridor, toward the exact door Halverson stood 15 feet from with his phone still to his ear. Mara's body went very still, and very calm, in the way it always did right before it moved. She did not run. Running drew attention, created noise, forced a reaction from a man who had clearly planned this entrance with care. Instead, she picked up a stack of folded blankets from the supply cart and walked, unhurried, on an intercept path that would put her directly in his way without appearing deliberate. The oldest trick in the book. And still one of the most effective, because nobody suspects a nurse carrying linens of doing anything but carrying linens. "Excuse me," she said pleasantly, stepping into his path just as he reached the corridor's threshold. "This hallway's restricted right now. Security protocol for the OR. Bathroom's actually back the other way." Past the vending machines, like she said. He looked at her, really looked. For the first time. And something in his gaze recalibrated, fast. The same recalibration she'd seen in Halverson's eyes an hour earlier. For a fraction of a second, his easy transfer coordinator smile flickered. Replaced by something flatter, more assessing. "Sure. Sorry," he said, already turning to comply, already performing the retreat of a harmless, slightly embarrassed visitor, but Mara had seen the flicker. And she had felt in the half-second his shoulder brushed past hers, the unmistakable hard edge of something holstered beneath his scrub top. Sitting just above his hip, not a phone, not a pager, nothing a transfer coordinator would carry. She did not grab him, did not shout, did not alert security with a raised voice that would spook him into whatever plan B a man like this kept ready. Instead, she let him walk 3 steps past her before she spoke again, keeping her tone light, almost bored. "Actually, sir, I need you to sign the visitor log properly before you head out. Hospital policy since the badge system update last month. It was invented entirely on the spot. But it was invented with the specific, deliberate purpose of stopping him, turning him back toward the nurse's station, away from the OR corridor. Buying 30 seconds she intended to use very carefully." He hesitated. The hesitation of a man deciding whether compliance was less costly than suspicion, and turned back toward her with the same too easy smile. "Of course." As he turned, Mara's eyes flicked once, briefly, to the security camera mounted above the nurse's station, then to the small black call button beneath the desk edge that Priya used for combative patients. A silent, one-press alert routed directly to hospital security and, Mara now suspected, whatever federal coordination Halverson had set up the moment he arrived. She reached it as she set down the blankets, pressing it with the same unhurried motion she used for everything, so that even a careful observer would have seen only a nurse tidying a countertop. "Right this way," she said, guiding him to the visitor log with a gesture, positioning her body, casually, deliberately, between him and the corridor he'd tried to enter. He signed a name that was almost certainly false, his pen moving with the faint, controlled tension of someone whose mind was elsewhere. Calculating exits, calculating time. Mara watched his hand rather than the name, noting the calluses at the base of his fingers, the way he gripped the pen like it was unfamiliar in his hand. A man who held weapons more often than pens. Security arrived 90 seconds later. 2 guards, unhurried, expecting nothing more than a routine badge check. It was Halverson who arrived first, though, moving with a speed that had nothing routine in it at all, his earlier phone call apparently forgotten, his eyes going straight to Mara rather than to the man at the desk. "Problem?" he asked her directly, ignoring the guards entirely. "This gentleman was looking for the restroom and ended up near the OR corridor," Mara said, her voice perfectly level, perfectly unremarkable, giving Halverson the true facts wrapped in a civilian's innocent phrasing, enough for a trained man to understand exactly what she meant, without alarming anyone else in earshot. I redirected him. Seemed disoriented. Halverson's eyes moved to the man at the desk, then to the crooked badge, then, for just a moment, back to Mara, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion. Something closer to recognition, still incomplete, still assembling itself. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," Halverson said to the false transfer coordinator. And this time there was no ambiguity in his tone at all. What happened next happened fast, and, to Mara's professional relief, quietly. The man made one attempt to bolt toward the ambulance bay doors, was intercepted within 4 strides by Halverson and a security guard together, and was on the ground with his arms secured before most of the floor staff had even registered the disturbance. No shots fired. No patients endangered. A brief scuffle, a raised voice, and then silence, restored almost as quickly as it had broken. Priya arrived at Mara's side, wide-eyed. "Did you know? Before all that, did you know something was wrong with him?" Mara considered the question and the honest answer, and chose the smaller truth instead of the larger one. "His shoes were wrong for the job," she said. "And he didn't know where the bathroom was even after you told him." Priya let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind people use to release fear rather than humor. "That's it, shoes? Sometimes that's enough," Mara said, and went back to her cart, because the floor was still full of patients who needed her, and because she understood, with the particular, settling dread of someone who has been in this exact position before, that this had only been the opening move. Halverson looked back at her once more before escorting the restrained man down the hall, and this time, his gaze held for 3 full seconds before he turned away. Mara did not need to guess what he was thinking. She had asked herself the same question the moment she'd noticed the shoes. Who is this nurse, really? Halverson found her 20 minutes later, in the supply room where she'd retreated to restock V-kits and, more honestly, to steady her breathing where no one could see her do it. He closed the door behind him without asking, which told her something about how the conversation was going to go before he said a single word. "That man in custody," he said, "carried no ID, no wallet. Nothing but a phone with one contact saved under a number instead of a name." He watched her face while he spoke, the way she imagined he watched every face, cataloging micro-expressions for a living. "He also carried a device we don't let civilians carry. Signal jammer. Short range, but enough to knock out a room's worth of monitoring equipment if he'd gotten close enough to use it." Mara kept her hands moving, counting saline bags she didn't need to count. "That's frightening. It should be." "It isn't for you." He said it plainly, without accusation, simply stating an observation. "You didn't flinch when I told you. Most people flinch. I've had a long night." "You've had a long career, is my guess," Halverson said, and let the silence after that sentence stretch, giving her room to fill it if she wanted to. She didn't. He exhaled, seeming almost amused by her discipline. "I'm not here to unmask you, Ms. Coleman. I don't have time, and frankly, right now I don't care who you used to be. I care about the fact that my patient in that OR is a Tier 1 asset with intelligence in his head, that at least one hostile team is willing to breach a hospital to either extract or silence. That man you stopped wasn't alone. He was a scout, which means the real team is already close." Something in Mara's chest went very cold and very quiet, not fear, but the old, familiar clarity of a mission taking shape around her whether she wanted it to or not. "What do you need?" she said. It wasn't a question. Halverson studied her for a moment longer, then reached into his jacket and produced a small handheld radio, not hospital issue, not civilian, its casing scuffed with the particular wear of long field use. "I need eyes on this floor that know what they're looking at. My people are stretched thin, covering the perimeter and the OR door. I have exactly one working relationship with local PD, who are 20 minutes out because of the road closures we arranged ourselves," which is its own special irony. He held the radio out to her, not quite offering it, testing instead. "This channel is secure. If anything else comes through that door looking like a nurse or an orderly and isn't, I need to know before it's standing next to my patient. Can you do that without me having to explain police procedure to you?" Mara looked at the radio for a long moment. Taking it meant crossing a line she had drawn very carefully for 2 years. The line between the woman who changed dressings and administered fluids, and the woman who once carried exactly this kind of device into rooms far worse than this one. She thought of the wounded man's cracked whisper, "Tell them whiskey's down," and understood that whatever was coming for him was not going to stop because she stayed inside her careful, unremarkable life. She took the radio. "Channel 4, Halverson said. "Don't broadcast unless it matters." And Coleman, He paused at the door, hand on the frame. Whatever you did before this, I'd guess you did it well. Don't make me regret finding that out under these circumstances. He left before she could answer, which was, she suspected, deliberate, giving her no obligation to confirm or deny anything at all. She clipped the radio to her waistband, beneath her scrub top, out of sight, and returned to the floor with her expression arranged back into its usual calm. The next hour tested that calm more than any hour had in 14 months. At 6:15, a delivery van pulled into the loading dock earlier than the scheduled linen service, and Mara clocked the discrepancy before the dock attendant did, watching through the service window as two men unloaded crates with movements too economical, too silent for men simply hauling towels. She keyed the radio low, angled away from passing staff. 4, this is ER station. Dock delivery, 90 minutes early, 2 unknowns, no visible ID badges. Requesting confirmation this is scheduled. The response came back clipped, professional. Copy, ER station. Checking manifest now. Negative, no scheduled delivery until 0800. Dock team is moving to intercept. 2 minutes later, the men were detained. A false alarm, as it turned out. An actual linen company simply running early and improperly logged. But the exchange had done something to the room's atmosphere that Mara could feel even without looking up. Priya had watched her make the call. Ellison, passing through on his way to check post-op status, had watched too. Nobody said anything, but the quality of the glances aimed at her had changed. Less curiosity now, more a kind of quiet, uneasy respect, the sort people extend to something they don't yet understand but have started, instinctively, to trust. At 6:40, a second incident tested her further. A woman in visitor's clothing, agitated and tearful, tried to push past the check-in desk toward the OR corridor, claiming her husband was inside and she needed to see him. The desk staff, sympathetic and unsuspecting, nearly let emotion override protocol, until Mara, arriving at the desk under the pretense of delivering a chart, recognized the inconsistency in the woman's story before anyone else did. "Ma'am, what's your husband's name?" Mara asked gently, guiding the woman toward a chair with the practiced softness of grief counseling rather than interrogation. Daniel Reyes," the woman said, voice cracking convincingly. "And when did he come in?" "An hour ago. Maybe more. I don't know, everything's a blur." Mara had already glanced at the admissions board behind the desk, which listed no Daniel Reyes, no patient matching that description admitted in the last 3 hours. It could have been an honest mistake. Hospitals were confusing at dawn. Grief made people scramble names, but the woman's eyes, beneath the tears, kept flicking toward the OR corridor doors with a precision that had nothing to do with searching for comfort. "I'm going to have someone walk you through admissions to find him," Mara said softly, and pressed the same silent call button beneath the desk she'd used an hour before, all while keeping her hand gently on the woman's shoulder, guiding her, not toward the OR corridor, but firmly away from it, toward the family consultation room, where 2 security guards intercepted her within 90 seconds. The woman did not resist. She simply stopped crying the moment the guards arrived, her face going smooth and blank in a way that confirmed everything Mara had already suspected, and let herself be led away without another word. Halverson's voice came through the radio moments later, low with something that might have been grudging admiration. "Second one in an hour. You're better at this than my actual perimeter team." "Luck," Mara said quietly into the radio, standing at the nurse's station with her back to the room so no one could read her lips. "Nobody's that lucky twice," Halverson replied and said nothing else, which felt somehow like the end of an argument he'd already decided he wasn't going to win. By 7 a.m., the floor had settled into a strange new equilibrium. Ordinary patients still arriving, ordinary complaints still being treated, but beneath it, a current of quiet vigilance that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier. Priya found Mara restocking gauze in Bay 3 and stood watching her for a long moment before speaking. "You've been different tonight," she said finally. "Not bad different, just different. Like you finally stopped hiding something you've been hiding the whole time I've known you." Mara did not deny it, which was in itself an admission larger than any words could have made. "When this is over," Priya continued, "quieter now, you're going to tell me what that was. All of it." "Maybe," Mara said, and for the first time all night, allowed the smallest, tired smile to cross her face. Depends how the rest of the morning goes. Somewhere down the corridor, the OR doors remained closed, the wounded man's surgery still underway, and somewhere beyond the hospital's walls, the real threat, the one the scout and the grieving woman had only been testing the edges of, was still moving closer, patient and unseen, waiting for its own moment to arrive. Mara checked the radio at her waist, felt its solid weight beneath her scrub top, and understood, with the settled certainty of someone who had done this before, that the quiet part of the morning was already over. The fire alarm was not a fire alarm. It began at 7:22 a.m. as a single sharp tone through the hospital's PA system, followed by the calm, recorded voice every hospital used for evacuation drills. This is not a drill. Please proceed to the nearest exit, except this time. The doors that were supposed to open for evacuation did not open. Mara felt it before she understood it. The electronic lock on the ER's main doors engaging with a heavy, final click. The kind of sound a building makes when someone with the right access codes decides no one is leaving. That's not our system, Priya said, staring at the doors, her voice gone thin. Our fire doors don't lock like that. They're supposed to release someone overrode it, Mara said. Already moving, the radio at her waist crackled. Halverson's voice tight and fast in a way it hadn't been all night. All units, we have a breach. North stairwell. Second team, at least 2 shooters, they've taken the stairwell door control and locked down Ward C. I need everyone off the floor and into shelter positions. Now. Ward C. Mara's mind mapped it instantly. The post-surgical recovery wing, 1 floor above the OR. Exactly, where a patient like the one currently on Ellison's table would be moved the moment surgery finished. They weren't attacking blind. They knew the hospital's layout, knew the recovery protocol, knew exactly where their target would end up in the next hour. Screaming rose from the direction of the main corridor. Then the particular silence that follows a gunshot in an enclosed space, flat, ringing, wrong. Patients in the ER waiting area scrambled for cover under chairs and behind the check-in desk. A young mother clutched her toddler to her chest, freezing in the open middle of the room, too frightened to find shelter. Mara reached her in 4 strides, pulling her by the shoulder toward the reinforced supply closet behind the nurse's station. Down, stay low, stay quiet, she said, voice low but absolutely steady, the kind of voice that gave frightened people something solid to hold on to. I need you to keep your daughter calm and stay in this room no matter what you hear. Can you do that? The woman nodded, shaking, and Mara closed the closet door behind her before turning back to the chaos of the floor. Ellison burst from the OR corridor, mask still hanging around his neck, blood on his gloves. We're mid-procedure, I can't move him. What the hell is happening? Gunmen have Ward C, Mara said. They're not here for the ER, they're here for your patient. Finish the surgery. Do not open those doors for anyone who isn't in scrubs you personally recognize. How do you know that? Ellison demanded, but there was no time for an answer. Because at that moment the radio crackled again. And this time it wasn't Halverson's voice, it was new. Male, calm in a way that was somehow worse than shouting, using the exact frequency Halverson had given Mara only an hour earlier. This is a general broadcast to hospital security and federal personnel, the voice said. We hold 12 staff and patients in Ward C. We are not interested in harming them. We want the man brought in under federal escort 4 hours ago, and we want him before his procedure is complete. You have 30 minutes. Every 10 minutes past that, 1 hostage comes down in the elevator. Do not test us on this. The line went dead. For a moment, the entire ER seemed to hold its breath together. Halverson's voice returned on the same channel, tighter now, edged with something Mara hadn't heard from him before. Not quite panic, but its close cousin. Coleman, I need you. North stairwell landing now. She moved before she'd fully decided to, weaving through overturned chairs and huddled patients, past security guards who were themselves crouched behind the check-in desk, radios pressed to their ears, waiting for instructions nobody in local law enforcement had trained them to give. She found Halverson at the base of the north stairwell, flanked by 2 of his own people, all 3 of them studying a hand-drawn floor plan someone had sketched on the back of an incident report. Local PD's still 15 minutes out because of the road closures we set up ourselves, Halverson said, not looking up. My tactical response team is 35 minutes from the airfield. I have 2 agents in a building full of civilians, and somebody up there just gave me a deadline instead of a demand. They're not going to trade hostages for time, Mara said, looking at the sketch, reorienting it in her mind against the floor plan she'd absorbed in 14 months of shift changes and supply runs. Ward C has one elevator bank and one stairwell exit, this one. If they wanted to escape with a hostage, they'd need this stairwell clear, which means right now their real leverage isn't the hostages. It's time. They're using the deadline to keep you from organizing a response, not because they actually intend to start executing people on schedule. You sound very confident. About the psychology of a hostage negotiation for someone with no vest and a name tag, one of Halverson's agents muttered. Mara didn't answer him directly. She looked at Halverson instead. Do you have eyes inside Ward C? One camera, mostly obstructed. I count 4 hostiles, maybe 5. 2 at the elevator, at least 1 moving room to room. Then here's what you don't do, Mara said, quiet and even, the old cadence returning to her voice without effort. The cadence of briefings she hadn't given in 2 years. You don't rush that stairwell with 2 agents against 4 armed hostiles in a space you can't see into. You lose people, maybe civilians too, for nothing, because your actual problem isn't retaking the ward. It's making sure they never get a hand on the patient in the first place, which means the priority isn't up there. She pointed to the ceiling, toward Ward C, then back toward the OR corridor. It's down here. Seal the OR, reinforce it physically, not just with a locked door. Buy Ellison the time to finish and get that patient moved the moment he's stable, somewhere they don't expect. Not the recovery ward they're already holding. Halverson studied her for a long beat. The same recalculating look from the trauma bay, except sharper now, faster. A man deciding in real time whether to bet a crisis on a stranger's instincts. And Ward C? You stall them, Mara said. You use the same channel they used. You tell them the patient's condition is critical, that moving him risks his life, that you need more time to safely transfer him. Which is true, incidentally, since he's still on a table. You give them a reason to believe patience gets them what they want. It buys you the 15 minutes until PD arrives, and it keeps them from executing anyone. Because a hostage taker who still believes negotiation is working doesn't usually escalate first. Usually, the skeptical agent said again, usually is the only currency anyone has in this situation, Mara said, and something in her flat, unhesitating delivery made even the skeptical agent go quiet. Halverson made his decision in the space of 2 seconds. The decision of a man who had run out of better options and recognized, finally and fully, that the woman in front of him had run scenarios like this before, more than once, in circumstances far worse than a locked ward in a suburban hospital. Do it, he told his agents. Reinforce the OR corridor. Barricade from the inside if you have to. I'll handle the channel. As his agents moved, Halverson looked at Mara one more time, and this time he didn't disguise the question in his eyes. Whatever you did before this, I need to know if it means you can also help me physically secure that corridor. Because I am critically short on hands. Mara thought of Ellison's patient still open on the table above them. Thought of the toddler she'd hidden in the supply closet. Thought of 2 years spent building a life specifically so she would never again have to answer a question like this one. I can help, she said, but nobody up there sees my face doing it. Not yet. Halverson nodded once, sharp and final, already moving toward the radio. Then let's move. They reached the OR corridor within 90 seconds. Mara directing the physical barricade. Supply carts angled just so. Gurneys locked wheel to wheel across the doorway at a stress point she remembered from a different door in a different country, years and lifetimes ago, while Halverson's agents followed her instructions without question, adrenaline replacing whatever skepticism remained. Ellison's voice came faintly through the OR doors, still working, still steady, buying the only kind of time that actually mattered. Above them, Ward C remained locked and silent. 12 people holding their breath inside it, and somewhere in that silence, a clock Mara had effectively just reset was ticking down toward a deadline she had bought 15 extra minutes against. 15 minutes that would decide, in ways she could not yet see, exactly how much of herself she would have to spend before this morning was over. She checked the barricade one final time, satisfied it would hold against anything short of sustained gunfire, and turned back toward the ward stairwell, where the real cost of the next hour was waiting to be paid. Halverson's stalling message went out over the channel at 7:31. Calm, procedural, exactly the kind of institutional language Mara had recommended, buying doubt instead of confrontation. For 6 minutes, it seemed to work. The men holding Ward C did not respond, did not escalate. And the building held its breath in that particular way a structure does when everyone inside it is listening for something they hope never comes. At 7:37, it came anyway. The elevator at the end of the north corridor chimed, doors sliding open on an empty car, except it wasn't empty. A hospital orderly, hands zip-tied, was shoved forward out of the car by someone unseen inside, stumbling into the hallway before the doors closed again, and the elevator began its ascent back to Ward C. The man was unhurt, terrified, gasping out that there were 3 others besides him, that the gunman had grown suspicious of the delay, that one of them, the one giving orders, had said the next one down wouldn't be walking. Halverson relayed this over the radio in a voice gone flat with controlled fury. They're not buying the stall anymore. PD's still 8 minutes out. Tactical response is 22 minutes minimum. Mara, still positioned at the OR corridor barricade, felt the weight of the next decision settle onto her before anyone spoke it aloud. Ellison's voice came faintly through the doors behind her. Stable, closing now, 10 more minutes, a small mercy that made the larger problem worse, because it meant the patient both sides wanted was almost ready to move, and the men above them were running out of patience to wait for him. I need someone in that stairwell who can actually do something if PD doesn't make it in time, Halverson said, and though he didn't look at Mara when he said it, everyone in the corridor understood exactly who he meant. This was the choice Mara had spent 2 years building a life specifically to avoid. Stepping into that stairwell meant becoming visible, not just to the gunman, but to Halverson's people, to Ellison, to Priya, to a hospital full of colleagues who had known her for 14 months as just a nurse. It meant the quiet, careful anonymity she had built brick by brick would end in the space of a single decision, in front of witnesses who would never again be able to unknow what they saw. But the alternative was a hostage coming down in that elevator every 10 minutes, and an 8-minute gap that federal response could not close in time. She did not deliberate long. She had learned a long time ago that deliberation was a luxury for situations where the cost of delay was smaller than the cost of the decision, and this was not one of those situations. Give me a way up that isn't the main stairwell, she said to Halverson. There's a maintenance stair off the east wing, feeds into Ward C through a utility corridor. It's not on their approach, which should be clear. But Coleman, if you go up there and it goes wrong, I don't have backup to send after you. I know, she said, and was already moving. Priya caught her arm at the end of the corridor, having appeared from nowhere the way she always seemed to when something mattered. Where are you going? Mara, what is happening right now? Mara looked at her friend and understood that whatever answer she gave in this moment would be the true beginning of the end of her anonymity, regardless of what happened next. I need you to stay here, she said instead, gently prying Priya's hand from her arm. Keep Ellison's corridor sealed. Whatever you hear from upstairs, don't come looking for me. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have time for, Mara said, and left her standing there, because there was no version of this morning left in which she could protect both her friend's understanding and the people trapped one floor above them, and she had made her choice about which mattered more the moment she'd taken Halverson's radio. The maintenance stairwell was narrow, poorly lit, smelling of dust and old paint, the kind of forgotten hospital space designed for pipes and electrical panels rather than people. Mara moved up it the way she had once moved through spaces exactly like it, weight low, breath controlled, every sense extended outward into the dark ahead of her, rather than inward toward the fear that any rational person would have felt, and that she simply no longer had time to indulge. She reached the utility door into Ward C's rear corridor at 7:44, and through the narrow wire-glass window, saw the situation Halverson's obstructed camera had only partially shown her. 3 armed men, not 4. The 4th, she guessed, was the one who'd shoved the orderly into the elevator and was likely still near the elevator bank at the corridor's far end. The 3 visible men had arranged the remaining hostages, 2 nurses and a wheelchair-bound patient, into a cluster near the nurses' station, using them as a soft perimeter rather than as immediate leverage, which told her something important. These were not amateurs improvising a robbery. This was a controlled, disciplined operation, executed by people who understood exactly what they were protecting themselves against. That recognition cost her something. It meant this would not end with words. She had no weapon. She had a radio, a stethoscope around her neck, and the particular calm of a woman who had decided, somewhere on the stairs below, exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend to keep 12 people from dying in a recovery ward on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Through the door's narrow window, she watched the nearest gunman's patrol pattern, 6 steps toward the elevator bank. Pause, 6 steps back toward the hostages, a rhythm repeated with the flat regularity of a man executing a plan rather than reacting to one. She timed it twice, confirming the gap, and understood that the gap was the only thing she had. She keyed the radio at her waist, voice a bare whisper. Halverson, I'm at the rear utility door, Ward C, 1 hostile on a 6-step patrol, gap of maybe 4 seconds when he's turned away from the hostages. I can create a distraction from this side that pulls at least one of them off the main group. I need PD or your agents to be ready to move the second that happens, because I cannot hold 3 armed men alone, and I'm not going to pretend I can. Copy, Halverson said, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the skepticism of an hour earlier. Not just trust now, but the particular deference of a man who had run out of better plans and recognized expertise when it finally showed itself plainly. PD's at the north entrance now. Give me 60 seconds to get them staged at the main stairwell. Do not engage directly unless a hostage is in immediate danger. That's not a request, Coleman. If this goes wrong, you're a nurse who wandered into a bad situation. You are not a one-woman assault team. Do you understand me? Understood, she said, and did not entirely mean it, because she had already decided, standing in that dusty stairwell, that if it came down to a hostage's life against her own careful anonymity, the anonymity would lose every time. The 60 seconds passed with the peculiar slowness of all genuinely dangerous waiting. Mara used it to steady her breathing, to feel the cold, familiar clarity settle fully into her body. Not adrenaline exactly, but its more disciplined cousin. The state she had once trained years to reach on command and had not needed, until this morning, in a very long time. At the 58-second mark, she pulled the small fire extinguisher from its bracket beside the utility door, and at the exact moment the nearest gunman's patrol turned him away from the hostages, she struck the door's release bar hard enough to send it banging open, then immediately stepped back into the stairwell's shadow rather than through the doorway, letting the sound do the work instead of her body. The gunman spun toward the noise, weapon raised, taking 3 full steps away from the hostage cluster to investigate. Exactly the gap Mara had promised. Halvorsen she could create. It was enough, barely, long enough for the 2. Remaining gunmen's attention to fracture, 1 instinctively covering the corridor, 1 staying with the hostages but turning his head toward the disturbance. And in that fractured half-second, the stairwell door at the ward's main entrance burst inward, PD and Halversen's agents moving in fast, controlled bursts, shouting commands that cut through the ward's tension like a blade. Mara did not see the rest of it directly. She had already retreated 3 steps back into the dark stairwell, out of the doorway's sightline, exactly as Halversen had asked. She heard it instead, shouted commands, a single gunshot, a scuffle, then the particular ragged quiet that follows a crisis breaking rather than exploding. She heard distantly a hostage crying with relief rather than fear, and understood from that sound alone that it had ended the way it needed to end. What she had not accounted for was the cost to herself. The fire extinguisher's release bar struck harder than she'd meant to strike it, had caught the edge of her palm on the follow-through, a shallow but ugly gash, bleeding freely down her wrist in the way scalp and hand wounds always bled more dramatically than their severity warranted. She hadn't felt it happen. She felt it now in the stairwell's dim light, throbbing in time with her pulse, and understood it as the smallest possible price for what had just been prevented. She wrapped it with a strip torn from her scrub sleeve, tight and practical, the way she'd been taught to field dress a wound decades ago and had taught dozens of ER patients to do since, and made her way back down the maintenance stairwell before anyone in Ward C could connect the sound of the door to the woman who'd caused it. By the time she reached the OR corridor again, Ellison was wheeling his patient out of surgery, stable, sedated, alive. And Priya was standing exactly where Mara had left her, face pale with 6 minutes of not knowing, eyes going immediately to the blood-soaked strip of fabric wrapped around Mara's hand. "You're hurt," Priya said, voice cracking between relief and accusation. "Mara, what did you do?" Mara looked down the corridor, toward the stairwell that led one floor up, to 12 people who were now being led out of Ward C alive, and felt the particular, hollow exhaustion of having paid a price nobody in that corridor would ever fully understand. "Just my job," she said again, the same small lie she'd offered Priya hours earlier, except this time, standing there bleeding, with Halverson watching her from 20 feet away with an expression that had moved fully past curiosity into something closer to certainty. The lie no longer fit the way it once had. She did not yet know that the largest cost of the morning was still ahead of her, not to her body, but to the 2 years of careful invisibility she had just, without quite admitting it to herself, spent completely. The hostages came down from Ward C in a slow, shaken procession, 2 nurses supporting each other. The wheelchair-bound patient wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from somewhere. The orderly who'd been shoved from the elevator now sitting on a gurney with a paramedic, checking his pulse more out of protocol than necessity. Local PD moved through the ward securing the 3 subdued gunmen. And for a few minutes, the hospital's north wing settled into the particular, exhausted stillness that follows violence rather than the tension that precedes it. Mara stood near the OR corridor with her hand wrapped and throbbing, watching Ellison's patient wheeled toward a private recovery room under heavier guard than any patient at St. Augustine had ever received, and allowed herself, for the first time in nearly 9 hours, to believe the worst of it might genuinely be over. She was wrong, though the correction came gently, almost quietly, not in the form of more danger, but in the form of a sound she hadn't heard in over 2 years. Distant at first, then unmistakably closer, the heavy, rhythmic beat of a helicopter's rotors descending toward the hospital's rooftop pad. A pad Mara had walked past 100 times without ever imagining it would be used for what it was about to be used for. Halverson's radio crackled. He answered it, listened, and his expression, already worn thin from the morning's events, shifted into something Mara couldn't quite read. He looked at her across the corridor, then spoke into the radio once more before clipping it back to his belt and walking toward her with the particular deliberateness of a man about to say something he'd been holding back for hours. "That's not mine," he said, nodding toward the ceiling, toward the sound of rotors now directly overhead. "Tactical response team I called for hours ago, finally inbound, except they're not landing for the patient. Dispatch says they're landing for personnel recovery. Specifically, they asked for confirmation of a name I gave them off a hunch about 20 minutes ago, based on a call sign your patient muttered in the trauma bay before surgery. A call sign I ran, off the record, the second I had a spare 30 seconds. Mara felt something in her chest go very still, the particular stillness of a person watching a door open onto a room they had spent years trying to keep closed. "Whiskey 6, Halverson said quietly, watching her face with total attention now. No pretense of casualness left in him at all. "That mean anything to you?" She did not answer. She did not need to. Her silence, and the way her spine had straightened almost imperceptibly at the sound of the call sign, answered for her. "I didn't think it would," Halverson said, not unkindly. "For what it's worth, I've run federal protection details for 11 years. I have never, not once, watched a bystander read a room, a threat, and a rescue window the way you did this morning. I made a call on a hunch because hunches are all I had left. And it turns out my hunch has a helicopter landing on the roof right now with your old unit designation on the manifest. The rooftop access door, usually locked and alarmed, had been opened by hospital security under Halverson's earlier instruction, and the rotor wash beat down through the stairwell in heavy gusts by the time Mara reached the roof. Halverson, a half step behind her, unwilling, or perhaps simply unable, to let this particular thread go unresolved. The helicopter that settled onto the pad was matte gray. Unmarked in the way vehicles are unmarked when marking them would tell strangers too much. And the man who stepped out from beneath its still turning rotors moved with the compact, economical bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired beneath a plain ball cap, and he crossed the rooftop toward Mara without hesitation, without needing to ask which of the figures gathered there was the one he'd come for. He stopped 3 feet from her, studied her face for a long moment, the face of a woman he had clearly not seen in some time, and then, in front of Halverson, in front of the 2 security guards who had followed them up, in front of Priya, who had climbed the stairs behind them uninvited and now stood frozen at the rooftop door. He did something that answered every question the morning had raised without a single word of explanation. He came to attention and saluted her. "Chief," he said, voice carrying easily over the fading rotor wash. "Command's been trying to reach you for 6 hours after your patient's ID came back. Didn't expect to find you elbow deep in a hostage rescue when we finally did." The silence that followed on that rooftop was total. Halverson's expression did not change so much as settle, the last uncertain pieces of the morning locking into a shape he had clearly suspected but not fully believed until this exact moment. Priya's hand rose slowly to her mouth, and Mara watched her friend's face cycle through disbelief, hurt, and something that might eventually become understanding. Though not yet, not in the space of these first few seconds, Mara did not smile. Did not straighten with pride or relief at being finally, fully seen. She simply exhaled, the long, controlled exhale of someone setting down a weight she had carried in secret for 2 years, and answered the older man with the same calm, unremarkable steadiness she had used all night on frightened patients and armed strangers alike. "At ease, Colonel," she said quietly. "I wasn't hiding from the work, just from the noise that used to come with it." The Colonel's eyes moved briefly to her bandaged hand, to the blood dried at her wrist, and something in his weathered face softened into an expression that was not quite a smile, but carried the same weight as one. "Command wants a full debrief. Whiskey 6 is stable thanks to whatever happened in that OR, and thanks, I'm guessing, to whatever happened before it too." He glanced at Halverson. "This your operation, Agent?" "Was," Halverson said. "Not sure it's been mine for the last 4 hours, if I'm honest." The Colonel's gaze returned to Mara, and for a moment, standing on that rooftop with the city waking up gray and ordinary beyond the hospital's edge, the two halves of her life stood face to face at last, not collapsing into each other the way she had always feared they would, but simply, quietly, meeting. "You don't have to come back," the Colonel said, and it was, Mara understood, both an offer and a genuine question. "Command respects the choice you made 2 years ago. This is just an ask, not an order." Mara looked past him, down through the rooftop door toward the ER floor below, where Ellison's patient lay stable in recovery, where Priya stood still frozen with 6 hours of unanswered questions on her face, where a hospital full of ordinary people had spent one extraordinary morning being kept safe by hands they'd only ever known as a nurse's. "I know," she said. "I'll come in for the debrief, but when it's done, I'm coming back here." The Colonel studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, the same brisk, respectful nod she remembered from a lifetime she'd told herself was closed. "Wouldn't have expected anything else, Chief?" He returned to the helicopter, and Mara stood on the rooftop watching it lift away, rotors churning the gray morning air, until the sound of it faded into the ordinary hum of the city below, leaving her alone with Halverson, with Priya's stunned silence and with the particular, heavy quiet of a secret finally, irreversibly spoken aloud. The hospital did not stop being a hospital simply because a helicopter had come and gone from its roof. By 9 that morning, the ER waiting room had filled again with its ordinary catalog of small emergencies: a sprained ankle, a child with a fever, an elderly man worried about chest pain that turned out to be indigestion. And Mara found herself almost gratefully folded back into the rhythm of work that asked nothing more complicated of her than competence. It was not, however, the same work it had been 12 hours earlier. She felt the difference in the way people looked at her now. Not suspicious, not afraid, but recalibrated. The way a room recalibrates around anyone whose true shape has just been revealed to be larger than the space they'd previously occupied. Priya did not speak to her for the first hour after the rooftop. She worked alongside Mara in a careful, wounded silence, handing off charts and supplies with the mechanical politeness of someone still deciding how to feel. Mara let her have the silence. She understood it, had expected it, and knew better than to fill it with explanations Priya wasn't ready to hear yet. It was Priya who finally broke it, near 10 o'clock in the relative privacy of the supply room, where Mara was rewrapping her injured hand with a fresh, more clinical bandage than the makeshift one from the stairwell. 14 months, Priya said. Not quite an accusation, though it carried the shape of one.
14 months of shift swaps and complaining about the coffee machine and you talking me through my divorce at 2 a.m, and I didn't know you used to be... What?
A colonel called you chief. What does that even mean? Mara finished the bandage before answering, giving herself the extra few seconds the small task allowed. It means I led people once, made decisions that got some of them home and didn't get others home, and eventually decided I'd made enough of those decisions for one lifetime. That's not an answer either. It's the true one, Mara said. I'm not being evasive to hurt you, Priya. I've spent 2 years not talking about it because talking about it doesn't change any of what happened. And it makes the people I tell carry weight they didn't ask to carry. You didn't need to know I used to command a special operations medical unit to trust me with your patients. You just needed to know I was good at my job. Priya was quiet for a moment, arms crossed, working through something that Mara recognized. The particular vertigo of realizing a person you thought you understood completely contained rooms you'd never been shown. Were you ever going to tell me? If none of this had happened. I don't know, Mara admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to land harder than any reassurance would have. Maybe, probably not soon. That's not very comforting. No, Mara agreed. It isn't. But it's honest, and I think you'd rather have honest than comforting. Given how the last 12 hours went, Priya almost laughed, a short, tired exhale that carried more relief in it than humor, and after a moment, uncrossed her arms. I'm not going to pretend I'm not a little freaked out, but you also just helped save 12 people's lives while bleeding out of your own hand and telling me it was nothing. So I don't know. I guess I'm glad you're the kind of person who has secret rooms like that, even if I wish I'd known where the doors were. That's fair, Mara said quietly, and let that be enough for now, because it was more understanding than she'd had any right to expect on a morning like this one. Dr. Ellison found her not long after, still in his surgical scrubs, exhaustion carved into his face, but his eyes sharp with the particular energy of a man who had just done the hardest work of his week and needed somewhere to put the leftover adrenaline. Your patient's stable, he said, without preamble, though they both understood he no longer meant your patient in the ordinary sense. Whiskey 6, or whoever he actually is. Vitals are good. He's asking for you if you're willing. She found the wounded man, she still didn't know his real name, and suspected she never would, awake and pale in his recovery bed, a federal guard posted discreetly outside his door, his eyes tracking her the moment she entered with the alert, assessing focus of someone whose training hadn't fully switched off despite the sedation still in his system. You're the one who covered my gear, he said, voice hoarse but clear. In the trauma bay? I remember that much. Among other things, Mara said, checking his chart out of old habit rather than necessity. They tell me a chief handled the floor while I was under. His eyes narrowed slightly, working through fatigue and recognition at once. Command doesn't hand out that call sign to just anybody. You ran combat medical evac. 4th or 5th rotation out, maybe. Long time ago, Mara said, adjusting his IV line with the same unhurried precision she'd used all night. Guess I owe you, he said. Twice, actually. Once in the field, evidently. Before all this, my CO mentioned your unit pulled 2 of ours out of a bad extraction a few years back, and now again for whatever happened while I was asleep. You don't owe me anything, Mara said. You did your part when you kept your mouth shut about what you were carrying, even half-conscious and bleeding out. That's harder than most people understand. He studied her for a moment, then offered the smallest, tired smile. Small world being a soldier. Smaller than you'd think, Mara agreed, and left him to rest, because there was nothing more useful she could offer him now except quiet and time. The same 2 things she'd spent 2 years giving herself. By early afternoon, the immediate chaos of the morning had folded itself back into paperwork, incident reports, federal statements, hospital administration fielding calls from a regional news station that had picked up scattered rumors of an incident without any of the real details. Halverson found Mara near the end of her shift, off the clock now, sitting in the stairwell where she'd taken her coffee break some 12 hours and 1 lifetime earlier. Debrief scheduled for Thursday, he said, sitting on the step below her without asking permission, an easy informality that hadn't existed between them that morning. Command wants your full statement. Mine too, for what it's worth, since I apparently ran half my operation on the instincts of a nurse I met 8 hours ago. You ran it fine, Mara said. You made the calls. I just gave you information. You gave me a great deal more than information, and we both know it. He was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. For what it's worth. I looked up your record between securing the scene and finding you on this roof. Some of it's classified past my clearance, which tells its own story. What I could see was enough to understand why Command sent a colonel personally instead of just a phone call. That was a long time ago, Mara said again. Quieter this time. Doesn't look like it stopped being true, Halverson said, not unkindly. You could requisition a transfer. Federal medical liaison work, something that uses what you clearly still have without putting you back in a war zone. Command would take you in a heartbeat from what I saw. Mara considered this, watching the stairwell's fire door propped open to the parking lot below. The same view she'd had at midnight, the world outside looking exactly as ordinary now as it had then, indifferent to everything that had happened inside these walls. Maybe someday, she said. Not yet. This place needs a nurse a lot more than Command needs another liaison. Halverson studied her for a moment, then nodded, seeming, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely at peace with an answer. Then I hope St. Augustine knows what it has. They don't, Mara said, and I'd like to keep it that way, as much as that's still possible. Halverson huffed something like a laugh, standing, brushing off his slacks. After this morning, Chief, I think that ship sailed a little further than you'd like. But for what it's worth, I'll write my report carefully. Some things don't need to be public record. He left her there, in the stairwell, with her coffee gone cold and her bandaged hand aching quietly, and Mara sat a while longer, feeling the particular exhaustion that follows not just a long shift, but the ending of a very long, very careful silence. She thought of Priya's stunned face on the rooftop, of the colonel's salute, of the wounded soldier's tired gratitude, and understood that none of it changed the fundamental shape of what she wanted her life to be. It only meant that shape now had a few more people who understood its true dimensions. She finished the last of her coffee, crushed the cup exactly as she had 12 hours before, and went back inside to finish her charting, because there were still patients on the floor who needed her, and that, more than any rooftop salute, was the part of the morning she intended to keep. 3 days later, St. Augustine Medical Center looked exactly as it always had. Same flickering fluorescent bulb in Bay 6 that maintenance kept promising to fix, same tired coffee machine in the break room, same rhythm of ordinary emergencies arriving in ordinary waves. The story of the incident, as hospital administration had taken to calling it in careful, non-specific memos, had already begun fading into the particular amnesia that busy institutions apply to anything that threatens to disrupt their routines for too long. The regional news station had run one segment, thin on details, calling it a security situation, resolved by the swift action of hospital staff and federal agents, with no names attached to either. Mara had watched it once, on the break room television, standing at the back of a small crowd of colleagues who had no idea the woman beside them was the reason the anchor's careful, vague language existed at all. She'd felt nothing watching it except a distant, settled relief that the vagueness had held. Her debrief in Washington had taken most of Thursday, long hours in a windowless room, recounting details to people who wrote everything down without expression, confirming things Halverson had already reported, filling gaps in a file she suspected would remain sealed for decades. She had answered every question honestly and completely, and had left at the end of it with the same quiet clarity she'd carried onto that rooftop 3 days earlier, that she had done what needed doing, and that doing it did not obligate her to become, again, the person she used to be full-time. The colonel had asked her once more, at the end of the debrief, whether she'd reconsider a transfer. She had thanked him and declined, the same answer she'd given Halverson, offered now with the settled finality of a decision that had already been made and did not need remaking. Priya had needed the full 3 days to fully metabolize what she'd learned, moving from wounded silence to careful questions to, finally on the second day, something that resembled her old easy humor, though laced now with a curiosity Mara suspected would never entirely fade. "So when you said you lost track for a second counting syringes," Priya had said, apropos of nothing, over lukewarm coffee in the break room, "was that like actual counting, or was your brain doing tactical math the whole time?" "Little of both, probably," Mara had admitted, and Priya had laughed. Really laughed for the first time since the rooftop. And something in the friendship had settled back into place, changed permanently but not broken, which was, Mara thought, more than she'd had any right to hope for. Dr. Ellison treated her with a new, quiet formality that took a few shifts to wear off, not unfriendly but careful. The way people are careful around something they've realized is more valuable than they'd previously understood. By the end of the week, even that had softened back into their old easy rapport, though he'd taken to occasionally, half joking, asking her opinion on trauma cases with a deference he'd never shown before the incident. The wounded soldier, she had learned. Eventually, through channels she suspected Halverson had quietly arranged, that his name was Reyes. A small, strange irony given the false hostage's fabricated husband, had been transferred out on the second day, stable enough for a secure federal medical facility. He'd sent no message, no formal thanks, which Mara understood perfectly. Some debts were better left unspoken, carried quietly rather than announced. The way she had carried her own debts for years, Halverson visited once more. On the fourth day, in civilian clothes rather than his federal windbreaker, ostensibly checking on hospital security recommendations following the incident review, though Mara suspected the visit had less to do with protocol than with him simply wanting to see, with his own eyes, that she had genuinely returned to the ordinary rhythm she'd insisted on keeping. Buildings adding new access controls on that maintenance stairwell, he told her, leaning against the nurse's station with the easy informality he'd developed toward the end of the crisis. Should have been reinforced years ago. Your report helped make the case. Good, Mara said. Be a shame if the next person who needed that stairwell didn't have it. There won't be a next time, if I have anything to say about it. He studied her for a moment. The same assessing look from their first conversation, though warmer now, worn smooth by 4 days of shared circumstance. You really don't want any recognition for this. Not even quietly, internally. Command offered a commendation. I've never seen anyone decline one so fast. What would it change? Mara asked and meant it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. The people in Ward C are still safe. Reyes is still stable. A commendation doesn't make either of those things more true. It just makes them mine to carry publicly instead of quietly, and I've had enough of carrying things publicly for one lifetime. Halverson didn't argue the point. He simply nodded, the same brisk, respectful nod she remembered from the rooftop, and said, For what it's worth, Chief, the quiet way is probably the harder way to live. I hope you know that most people wouldn't choose it. Most people didn't spend the years I spent learning why the noise isn't worth it, Mara said, and left it there, because it was as much explanation as she had left to give. He left without further ceremony, and Mara went back to her charting, back to the ordinary catalog of vitals and small kindnesses that made up the actual substance of her days. A broken wrist in Bay 2, an elderly woman anxious about test results in Bay 5, a toddler with an ear infection whose mother needed more reassurance than medicine. That evening, near the end of her shift, she took her coffee break in the same stairwell she'd used the night everything began, propping the fire door open the same way, watching the same ordinary sweep of headlights across the parking lot below. The city moved on beneath her exactly as it always had, indifferent, unhurried, entirely unaware of how close one of its ordinary Tuesday mornings had come to becoming something much worse. Priya found her there, as she often did, leaning against the stairwell door with her own cup of coffee. You ever think about it? She asked. Going back, I mean, properly, not just declining transfers to be polite. Mara considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things now, having learned the cost of not being honest with the people who mattered. Sometimes, she admitted, there's a part of that life that made sense in a way ordinary life doesn't always. Clear stakes. Clear purpose. She looked out at the parking lot, at the mundane, unremarkable evening settling over it. But I like this too. The smallness of it. Helping one broken wrist heal instead of managing 100 variables in a war zone. I spent a long time believing the second thing mattered more. I don't believe that anymore. So you're staying? I'm staying, Mara confirmed. Same shifts. Same coffee machine that needs fixing. Same you, complaining about the same things if you're willing. Priya smiled, small and genuine. I think I can manage that. Though I reserve the right to occasionally ask if you're doing tactical math while counting gauze. Fair, Mara said, and something in her chest, unclenched for the first time in what felt like years, settled fully into place. Not the settling of a secret finally spoken, but something quieter and more permanent. The settling of a woman who had been seen fully by the people who mattered most, and had discovered that being seen did not require her to become someone else. She finished her coffee, crushed the cup the same way she always did, and went back inside to finish her shift. No commendation, no headline, no applause waiting for her on the other side of the door, just a hospital full of ordinary people who needed ordinary care, and a woman quietly, deliberately choosing once again to be the one who gave it to them. The fluorescent light in Bay 6 flickered once as she passed beneath it and did not go out.